Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome to Clearer Than Truth. Today we're joined by Dana Stroul, the Director of Research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. Dana has shaped U.S. policy on some of the most complex and turbulent issues in the region, from the Israel-Iran conflict to the shifting alliances across the Middle East. We're honored to have her insight as we discuss the latest developments, especially the evolving situation with Iran and its regional impact. Dana, thanks for joining us.
Good to be with you both.
So obviously, within the last week, I think it was a week ago today, Israel struck Iran and the war seems to be escalating. How did we get here?
Well, what happened about a week ago is Israel started an operation called Rising Lion. And what they've done in the past week is use military force to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, and as they describe it, eliminate the nuclear threat from Iran, as well as degrade and work to eliminate Iran's missile defense or missile program, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, military industrial complex. And as part of that operation, the Israelis have also targeted the upper echelons of Iran's security leadership, IRGC leadership, which is their, the IRGC is a U.S. designated terrorist organization. So they're the element of the Iranian security apparatus that has cultivated the network of militias and terrorist organizations across the Middle East that have continued to destabilize many countries across the Middle East. And Israel has also targeted the upper tier of Iran's nuclear scientists, so the people who are actually working to position Iran to develop that nuclear weapon. And how we got there is that over the course of this year, for the first part of the second Trump administration, there has been an emphasis and work by the Trump team to negotiate an agreement to deal with Iran's nuclear program. And right before the upcoming round of talks that were supposed to take place in Oman, Israel decided to launch operations which stopped negotiations from moving forward. And now the world is focused on whether or not there's a possibility of returning to the negotiating table.
Why did Trump pull us out of the original JCPOA in 2018?
So the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran Nuclear Agreement for short, is an President Obama-era deal that went into effect in 2015. And the idea of that agreement is to put serious constraints around Iran's nuclear program, flood Iran with inspectors who could verify that the Iranians were not moving for a nuclear weapon capability. And in the theory of that agreement, the Iranians received some sanctions relief related to nuclear sanctions in exchange for moving the window back to 1 year of what we called at the time breakout capacity. So 1 year before the Iranians could move to cross that nuclear threshold for a nuclear weapon device. When Trump came into office the first time, there were real criticisms of that agreement. The criticisms fall into a few buckets. One is that it was a time-limited agreement. So there were only 10 years that agreement was into effect, and presumably on the other side, critics of the agreement would say that the Iranians could have then decided to pursue a nuclear weapon. Number two is that agreement, the JCPOA, did not require Iran to dismantle any of its nuclear weapons infrastructure. So essentially, they were able to mothball their nuclear facilities. And finally, the Iran nuclear agreement allowed Iran to maintain domestic enrichment capacity. And so the critics of the agreement would say that because Iran did not have to dismantle their nuclear infrastructure, because they were able to maintain under this agreement low-level uranium enrichment, that provided them the option of reverting back to a nuclear weapon program if the political decision was made at some point. So Trump, when he came into office, looked at all of those indicators and said, this is a terrible deal. I'm ripping it up. I can negotiate a better deal. And to do that, I'm going to impose what he called and his team called a maximum pressure campaign. So full economic sanctions meant to increase and ratchet up pressure so significantly on Iran's economy that the regime would feel coerced to return to the negotiating table and negotiate for a much more significant in terms of constraints on their nuclear program.
And I don't want to take all the time, George, pop in whenever, but do you think a deal was still possible before the strike?
I think a deal has always been possible. The question is whether or not that deal would have been acceptable for us, and by us I mean the United States first, and secondly for the Middle East and for Israel. And by all accounts, the reports of the negotiations that were being pursued by Steve Witkoff, the President Trump's envoy and personal friend, are that it would have conceded domestic enrichment for some period of time. And so I think for Israel and a lot of people here, especially in Washington, D.C., who were looking at the trajectory of those negotiations, it didn't look like a sufficient deal from a non-proliferation standard. And you could see that there was momentum here in Washington. So, for example, most members of the Republican Senate caucus, so 52 Republican members of the Senate, signed a letter to President Trump insisting that there be absolutely no domestic enrichment allowed under any new diplomatic arrangement with Iran. And there was nothing indicating in those negotiations that the Iranians were willing to concede on that point. So I think there could have been a deal in which there could have been inspectors and constraints and perhaps new sunsets, but whether or not it would have been acceptable and really dealt in a meaningful way with Iran's ability to pursue a nuclear weapon at some point in the future remains very much in question.
Right. I want to jump in here because, it strikes me that there were so many instances in the Biden administration where we saw like Jake Sullivan jutting off to Vienna, to try to revive the JCPOA. And, what the Iranians wanted to revive it struck me as being, sort of a line that even he wasn't willing to cross, even though so much had been sacrificed for the original deal. And so, I wonder, how you see that. And also, I think it's so easy to forget that, the justification for domestic enrichment is for energy production, right? And yet Iran as a regime is drowning in access to other types of energy, right? So, why is it that we continuously find so much credibility ascribed to this desire for domestic enrichment when really the sole purpose for it, so far as I understand, is entirely not credible in Iran's case?
Well, first of all, on the domestic enrichment situation, I agree with you that it's a major concern. What we're actually seeing happen broadly across the Middle East is many countries are looking at the fact that they have focused their economic growth on oil and natural gas. They're looking at the energy climate when peak oil comes and what more sustainable, renewable forms of energy are. And there are other countries in the Middle East who are thinking about greener energy and have thought about peaceful civilian nuclear programs. So the best example would be the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, who wanted a domestic nuclear peaceful program for nuclear energy purposes. They signed a very specific agreement with the United States to certify that there would not be domestic enrichment, that there were certain protocols that would be adhered to for a very safe, peaceful nuclear energy program. And that's really the pathway that would be in the U.S. interest from a security perspective. And you're right that nothing about the Iranian program would suggest that it was exclusively peaceful. And in fact, only a few days before the Israelis started their military campaign, there was this really significant meeting at the IAEA, a Board of Governors meeting in Vienna, where the Director General of the IAEA says publicly, and they've released his comments, so it's out there for the whole world to see, there is absolutely no peaceful explanation for this level of nuclear enrichment and this program. If you actually have a peaceful program for domestic energy purposes, it doesn't look like what the Iranians were doing. And so Rafael Grossi, has been very, very clear on that point. And you heard Trump administration officials in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the initiation of the Israeli military campaign exactly the point you're making, George, which is that this is what a peaceful energy program looks like. you actually don't need domestic enrichment if you're just talking about nuclear energy for your own people. And we're willing to work with the Iranians to actually have that kind of program. And I think the bluff on the Iranian side was called because they're just not willing or have not yet been willing to concede on domestic enrichment. And on the question about the negotiations under the previous administration, this is an interesting moment we're in right now where the American people and government are contemplating using our own military to address Iran's nuclear program. But before the past week, the issue of Iran's nuclear ambitions and the possibility that the Iranians would seek to acquire a nuclear weapon capability has been one of the highest priorities of the past 5 presidential administrations, both Democrat and Republican. Every president comes into office, looks at this problem set, and says, no nuclear weapon, can't happen on my watch. Military options are on the table, but I really prefer a diplomatic arrangement, and so I'm going to prioritize talks and try to do it that way. So you saw an agreement that put constraints on, but did not eliminate completely the risk of a nuclear weapon capability under the Obama administration. We had the Trump administration pull out, and after the Trump withdrawal, the Iranians took step after step after step that took them so much closer to that threshold where they could choose to break out. So in the Biden team, I think they looked at this problem set and said, this is really serious. We're also committed to the Iranians not getting a nuclear weapon, and we're going to test the waters of diplomacy first. And as you know, the rest is history. There were multiple attempts. There was, of course, a lot of changes in Iran. There were changes here. And at some point in the Biden administration, because we were so close to those restrictions on Iran's program ending anyway, as I said earlier, because they only lasted a decade, the Biden team looked at this problem set and said, getting back into the 2015 nuclear arrangement doesn't really make sense for us, given how far the Iranian program has advanced. So we're going to pause on actually negotiating to re-enter the JCPOA. We're open to something else, but it has to be longer and stronger. And by the way, the Iranians have all of these other really challenging, destabilizing activities that they're doing. Maybe something might have happened, but then, of course, we got to October 7th. Hamas commits this terrible act of violence and terrorism against the Israeli people, and all of the priorities about what the United States was doing in the Middle East changed.
Let's look at that a little bit. Everyone knows that Hamas is a proxy for Iran, but how does that actually work? This may seem simplistic, but it's something I've wondered a lot about. Does Iran literally take a truck, load it with weapons, and ship it to Hamas and say, have it?
No, because I think the Americans and the Israelis would see that truck and say, absolutely not. We're going to figure out some way to block that truck. So first, I think just to take a step back, the Iranian approach to what does the Iranian government want first and foremost? Regime survival. And it has invested in a variety of ways to protect the regime. And one of the theories of the case for Tehran is to keep war away from Iran, keep it out somewhere else, far away from Iran's borders. So one has always been dangling the threat of a nuclear weapon, that if we are attacked inside Iran, we will respond by crossing the nuclear threshold. 2 has been, it's what was a vast missile arsenal, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and more recently attack drones. If you attack us, we will send all of these ballistic missiles and devastate not just your militaries across the region, but civilian infrastructure and civilians as well. And 3 is this network of militias and terrorists. So that is Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, who have been attacking commercial shipping and navies in the Red Sea, the militias in Iraq and Syria. And of course, Tehran had this partnership with then dictator Bashar al-Assad in Damascus, who allowed the territory of Syria to be used to proliferate weapons, funding, training, and other stuff all across the Middle East to Hezbollah and then to Hamas. So there was a lot of focus, or has been a lot of focus, on this, the land bridge from Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus to Beirut. So what this looks like in terms of how Tehran supported Hamas, first of all, we're not talking about suitcases of cash or truckloads of cash. They're using the same networks that terrorists and criminals use everywhere, cryptocurrency, other ways of moving money. The internet, of course, and different ways of exchanging tactics and techniques about terrorist activities and planning. The Iranians are certainly providing guidance, training, operational directions to their proxies and militias across the Middle East. And then there's weapons. And some of that is happening across land borders. And there's also reports of things like transport drones being used to actually transport through the air. And then there's sea routes. That's one of the primary ways in which the Iranians have supplied the Houthis in Yemen. And it's one of the reasons why the Israelis have worked to impose a naval blockade on Gaza so that Hamas cannot be resupplied by sea.
Okay. When we look at the current players, there seems to be by Netanyahu an emphasis on the importance of taking out certain leaders within Iran. Yet the U.S. took out Soleimani. I don't think many people think that made us more safe. Is there any actual value to sort of trying to cut off the head of the snake if you're not going to kill the Ayatollah?
That is a really complicated question. So in the case of Iran, first of all, the Ayatollah is the leader of a country. And assassinating or taking out the leader of any country is a serious piece of business. And what it means in terms of normalizing that as a tactic in war, I think has very serious consequences and implications and needs to be examined. What is, I think, really important distinction about the Israeli campaign in Iran is that the way that the Israelis described it at the beginning was to eliminate the nuclear threat and the missile threat. They were not talking about regime change or regime collapse. And when members of the Trump administration have talked about it, they've defined why they might get involved militarily as to address some very specific threats. And I think the experience and lessons of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars looms very large here. This idea that just because we think a certain government is deeply problematic does not mean that ousting it gets you something more stable or opens the opportunities you want on the other side. And if you don't know enough about the nature of the society, the power structures, the opposition, or what alternative leadership is on the other side, you should think twice before undertaking something like this. And so I think that is precisely the debate that's playing out right now. Now, from the perspective of some, this regime in Tehran is, Henry Kissinger quote, Iran has to decide if it's a cause, if it's a cause or it's a state. And a lot of the activities of the regime, they appear to not be willing to make any concessions. So the core area of concern right now is that Iran should not be able to have any pathways to a nuclear weapon. In order for the world to be reassured that Iran would not have any pathways to a nuclear weapon, they would need to concede that they would no longer have a domestic enrichment capability. And that appears to be the exact thing that Iranian negotiators and the supreme leader himself, in a big speech he gave a couple of days before the Israeli military campaign, are unwilling to concede. And I think that gets certain people, when they look at this problem set, that logic train leads you to, well, then you just have to change the regime. And the challenge, of course, is nobody really has a good track record of regime change and it coming out very well on the other side.
Well, before we started recording, and then after this, I'll let George speak a lot more than I am, but you've piqued my interest. But look, it seems to me, before we were recording, you were talking about your role in thinking through what would come after, like Saddam and Iraq and whatnot. Does the Trump administration have a good sense of what the country would become if there was regime change?
No, nobody does.
Yeah.
No, there's no. What we've seen actually in at least the past decade in Iran is that there have been protests against the regime, and we can see that there are a lot of people, a lot of Iranian citizens who are dissatisfied with the leadership and the services they're receiving from this government. So what we were seeing before Israel's Operation Rising Lion was tremendous dissatisfaction with the regime. They were not able to keep the lights on anywhere. They were rolling electricity blackouts. Kids weren't in school 5 days a week. People weren't able to go to their offices. There was the Women Life Freedom protest a couple years ago. Recently, there's been truck driver protests. It's very clear that this is an inept and corrupt government who's not delivering for the Iranian people. And now they've been exposed as not being able to defend and keep safe people from an external attack. So this is a really damaged regime. The challenge is none of those protests or opposition movements have ever demonstrated sufficient organization or an alternative in terms of leadership. And so the idea that on the other side of changing out this regime, there would be a government or a leader that was willing to work with the United States to flood the area with inspectors, render safe the whole nuclear program, give up the missile program, stop funding all of the terrorists, that all the ways in which we'd want Iran to be a good, reliable member of the international community, that would magically happen, I think is difficult to conceive. And so that is part of the problem. And we were talking about my experience in grad school and my first tour in the Pentagon working on post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization. The basic lesson is you never really know what's going to happen on the other side of war. It's generally dynamic and unpredictable. And in societies that have been terrorized by their own government for as long as the Iranian people have, there are real structural challenges, and we should rigorously question that it would be smooth on the other side. And what that means is that the United States would have to be prepared to assist and engage on the other side of this campaign. And basically, the Trump administration is saying we're not going to have any part of that. We might join in some military strikes, but then we're done and we're out of here. Generally, that's not the best cocktail of policy options to lead to more stability.
Right. I would certainly agree. And I think, I try to, when we get to these broader questions of the stability of regimes and their effect on the region, to sort of remind people what, before World War I, people used to ask about Germany. They revived Mirabeau's comment, is this a state with an army or an army with a state? And in Iran's case, I think you could actually make the case that we have something akin to the latter. And when we look at the organizing principle of Iran's government, the sort of Vilayat al-Faqih, the sort of rule by the jurist, I mean, this is extreme autocracy. And so, you have decades of this rule, and you have the, Islamic, movement, the Islamist movement in Iran, which was not at the time of the revolution the most popular, but they had the most cunning operators, the most vicious, folks willing to seize power. What comes out of that? I don't know. And, Iraq is one example, Libya is another. It's quite concerning, the idea we could have a kind of collapse there. And it's an incredible tapestry of a country full of different groups and subgroups. And, it backs up against other parts of, frankly, Central Asia that are themselves also unstable. So all these factors, I think, are important, but it's interesting as we kind of look forward to the next kind of couple of years and how crucial this inflection point is. I wonder if you see any kind of particular moments in the last decade or so that are like that moment that Ambassador Oren often speaks about, where he advised President Obama, please don't allow concrete into Gaza, right? Please. And this apparently was his first conversation. And President Obama said, well, you've misunderstood. This is a humanitarian thing that people need, right? Is there one crucial factor here that is going to, in the long run, be decisive in terms of whether we're right back here in 5 years, bunker busting another bunker, or is it a kind of broader picture we need to be considering?
It's such an important question, and so let me unpack that a little bit. First of all, I think some of the debate around Israel's military campaign in Iran and what the United States may or may not do tends to think that this is just going to end when this campaign ends. And that's not what we're talking about. There is no military operation or days or weeks of operations that eliminate Iran's nuclear program. It can eliminate and destroy the infrastructure. It may be able to render safe its enriched uranium stockpile. And yes, many of the nuclear scientists have been eliminated. But a country's ambition and an experience like this is likely actually to induce and convince the regime leadership that it even more is in need of a nuclear device now, so that this would never happen again. And so the question is, what do you do to deal with the fact that centrifuge facilities, military industrial complexes can be rebuilt, uranium can be re-enriched? How do we deal with behavior and psychology? So first of all, on the other side of this military campaign, we need to be having a serious conversation in our country with Israel and with allies and partners who also share our desire for Iran to never have a nuclear weapon on what kind of intelligence, resourcing, inspectors, and constant vigilance of this problem set are willing to put in to make sure that they don't reconstruct the program. That's number one. There is an open question on the other side of this. It's hard for me to believe or see a possibility that even though the Israeli strikes to date have been stunning in their operational success. I mean, the fact that Israel can now say that it controls a lot of Iranian airspace is just remarkable. But it's doubtful that the regime takes a knee and says, okay, I give up now. We've had this program for decades. We've invested so much of our national resources and treasure in this capability. You got us. We're done now. That's probably not what's going to happen here. So we have to think about what happens on the other side of this. But George, to your question, the pathway for how this could turn out, and I'm a deep skeptic that it would, but the United States has actually recently demonstrated that it is willing to re-engage with a country that has been a state sponsor of terrorism and proliferated terror and all sorts of bad things. And that would be Syria. So in the case of Syria, we had a dictator, Bashar al-Assad, who followed his father, Hafiz al-Assad. And just to remind your listeners about some of the bad stuff that came out of Syria under the Assad regime, a biological and a chemical weapons program, mass barrel bombing of civilians, mass imprisonment and torture of civilians, harbored hardened al-Qaeda terrorists in the prisons of Syria and let them go at some point to cross into Iraq to kill U.S. soldiers, which is how al-Qaeda in Iraq started. Al-Qaeda in Iraq becomes ISIS. The Assad regime gave enough space for ISIS to operate in Syria. We could go on and on and on. Strategic partner of Moscow and Tehran allowed Iran to use Syrian territory for the proliferation and the terrorist networking that we were talking about earlier in this conversation. Okay, but Bashar al-Assad fled to Moscow in December of 24. A new leader takes over, a man named Ahmed al-Shara, who now is let's call him a descendant of the al-Qaeda ilk, came out of the U.S.-run prisons without hardened al-Qaeda terrorists in Iraq, has been hanging out in northwest Syria for years, running an al-Qaeda offshoot called Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Eventually, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is so successful on the ground that it outs the Bashar al-Assad regime. Now they say, we're changing our name and we're going to govern for all Syrians. And Ahmed al-Shara has asked for international organizations like the one that prevents the use of chemical weapons to come in and clear out the rest of the Assad regime's chemical weapons stockpile, has said the Iranians cannot freely use the territory of Syria, is trying to go after the narcotics and Hezbollah trafficking circles that would see Hezbollah replenished in Lebanon, has apparently proactively operated on intelligence that the U.S. has given him to go after ISIS cells in Syria, has said that he wants to govern for all of Syria. And in about 4 months of President Trump's presidency, gets to shake hands with the President of the United States in Saudi Arabia. And the president says, I'm going to provide sanctions relief, including the state level sanctions that were preventing Syria from replugging into the international economy, specifically the designation of Syria as a state sponsor of terrorism. This is nothing short of tectonic. And this guy, has done some things that should be reassuring to the international community in the United States, but he has not. He has not been in office more than a year, and he was not democratically elected. And he is completely embraced by the leaders of the region and Turkey, and now the President of the United States, and his foreign ministers are being received in all the diplomatic receiving halls of Europe. So if you're Iran and you're the Iranian people and you're the remaining part of the Iranian governing apparatus, and you're looking over at the Syria example, I'm simply saying that there is a path here where if you don't have leadership at the top that's doubling down on these really destabilizing activities, there is a path for Syria to receive, or for Iran to receive, pretty broad sanctions relief in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, it's curious. How this is all playing out. I mean, do you think that for all of these compromises and kind of decisions to engage with folks who we may have reason to be concerned about, is there an underlying shift that the Trump administration is trying to carry off, which is to move the U.S. back to what some might call the kind of somewhat traditional position of engagement with Sunni, states in the region as a counterbalance against Iran? And is that kind of just we're moving back after a period of attempted change to what is kind of the typical equilibrium of power balancing, or are we just in a fundamentally different world, and that's an unhelpful way of understanding it?
I do think we're in a fundamentally different world, especially in the Middle East. I think everything about the assumptions we've had about the way the Middle East is and how we address the challenges that come out of the Middle East changed after October 7th and the Hamas attack on Israel. And so the strategic table has been shuffled and reset, and we need to think differently. But I think President Trump heard a very clear message from the monarch specifically of the Middle East, which is that Bashar al-Assad, he was a bad hombre, and he welcomed in Iranian interference in a deeply destabilizing way. And if we don't give Ahmadinejad a chance, then we're just going to have another seething cesspool of instability that's going to be bad for the Middle East, bad for us, bad for Israel, and bad for you. So we better give him a shot here at trying to stabilize the situation. And so this is a test case. But if you're Iran, which most governments and leaders in the Middle East would all agree that Iran has been the center of gravity of instability for decades in the Middle East. It is the one that exports terrorism, funds, arms, trains, directs, proxies, militias, and terrorist groups. Its cyber activity, its cyber attacks inside the United States, its network of terror cells way beyond the Middle East, its assassination campaign of former Trump administration officials, its illicit nuclear weapons program, its ballistic missile arsenal, its provision of attack drones to Russia to use against Ukrainian civilians in Ukraine. All of these are really, really problematic activities. If you had a change in the government, where the government says, we're not going to do these things, we want to be a normal country and re-enter the community of nations, what the Trump administration has demonstrated is that it's willing to offer you the benefit of the doubt.
So how does the conflict end? The current conflict? Can it ever end?
I think that very much depends on decisions coming up in Iran, in Tehran, in Israel, and in the United States, and we don't know yet. What is clear is that this conflict does not end when Israel's military campaign ends. There will need to be some sort of diplomacy and negotiations on the other side. Now, whether those negotiations and diplomacy are with a hostile government or a changed, reformed government remains to be seen, in my view. But for sure, in terms of the core concern that the United States has had, which is Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, that issue is not solved after the military campaign ends. It will require constant vigilance, engagement, leadership, and frankly, very significant resourcing of intelligence and other ways to ensure that we understand exactly what's happening with that program.
And final question for you, because I want to be respectful of your time. Is there a world where the U.S. has boots on the ground in the current conflict in the next 6 months to a year?
I am too humble to predict what may or may not happen inside the Trump administration. I will be honest. I thought I was reading the tea leaves of the president, and I thought we would not be where we are, that he was, said in his inauguration speech, I want to be judged by the wars that the United States does not enter into, and we need to get out of forever wars that are land wars in the Middle East. So I am eating my own, a big piece of humble pie here, because I did not think we were going to be where we were today. So one does not need ground forces in order to accomplish U.S. objectives. There are other ways of doing it. But we're going to need something on the ground at some point. It doesn't necessarily need to be military or armed forces. It could be inspectors on the other side, rendering safe what remains of this program and flooding the zone with inspections. That's going to have to come as part of some negotiation and diplomacy.
Okay. Dana, we've had you for almost 40 minutes. Thank you for your time. For our listeners, where could they follow your current work?
I am currently the research director at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I am taking a little bit of a vacation from X, but I try to stay active on LinkedIn. And anything that I publish, the Washington Institute or one of the other foreign policy outlets will publish, and they can find me there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Dana, thank you for sharing your deep expertise and perspective on these critical issues. As the Middle East continues to evolve, your insights help us understand the stakes at what's ahead. We appreciate your time. Look forward to your work as the region's story continues to unfold.